All right, in this next module, we're going to be looking at, again, Power Pivot and how to create a data model out of the data that we just imported. So last module, we covered how to import data into Power Pivot. Now we're going to look at the data modeling piece where we make sense of the data. Okay, and just because we got it into Power Pivot doesn't mean it makes any sense yet. So in this section, what we're going to cover is, of course, what is a data model? We got to understand that first. And then we're going to also get into creating relationships. So oftentimes we'll import multiple data sources like we did in this case, and they don't necessarily relate automatically. So we're going to have to create relationships where they don't exist. We're also going to look at some usability things like creating hierarchies, as well as some other usability things like hiding columns, renaming columns, all the kind of usability enhancements that are really important. So let's talk about these things first before we demo them. All right, so first, again, inside the self-service BI lifecycle, within that lifecycle, in this case, we're actually looking at the data modeling portion. So we're trying to make sense of the data, pull it together in a way that we can eventually report on. All right, so data modeling first. So in case this is new to you, let's talk in general, what is a data model? What does it make sense? Why are we pulling this data in here? Why do we have to organize it? That's a question that a lot of people that are new to Power Pivot have. So first of all, a Power Pivot data model is some of the underlying structures to what Power Pivot uses to present the data. It organizes the data, it shows relationships in the data, and it's where you can create things like hierarchies. There's even a nice little diagram view inside Power Pivot to let you visualize all the relationships and the data model itself. Now, some of the important pieces of what the components are of a data model are things like tables and relationships. So those tables and relationships are the components that make up a data model. And there's really two types of data models. A lot of people don't realize this, but it's important to understand that you have both a logical data model and a physical data model. The physical data model is what came from the original source. So our physical model is an Access database and an Excel sheet. And we bring those two together and they don't necessarily relate. Now, the logical model is inside of Power Pivot. Okay? The logical model is where we can relate things that don't necessarily have a relationship. So think of physical model as the underlying data. Logical model is what Power Pivot does, where we can actually relate things together that maybe didn't have a relationship previously. Okay? So that's what a data model is. Organizing and pulling together these data sources and being able to organize those tables and relationships. Now let's talk a little bit about creating a relationship. Well, first of all, when you create a relationship, you need to do it between two columns that have the same data type. That's obviously very important. Now here's one of the deficiencies of Power Pivot is you can only create relationships on one column from one table and another column from, basically it has to be one column in each table. Okay, so if I'm relating table A and table B, I can only choose one column from table A and one column from table B to be based on my relationship. Kind of a downside, because if you think about how a lot of models work, whether it's SQL Server or Oracle or even just regular Access databases, oftentimes they'll be related on multiple columns. So I need both of these columns in this join to make a distinct join between two tables. Power Pivot doesn't work that way, but there are some capabilities by using the DAX query language to concatenate fields together and make it so that you can still join on one column, even though you're really referring to two under the cover. So we'll talk about that in the DAX section of the class, on how you can deal with that scenario. There are ways to deal with it though. So we're going to talk about that. We're also going to look at relationship types. There's really two types of relationships. There's active and inactive relationships. Now, the case of why you would have an inactive relationship is a role-playing dimension or a role-playing table. What a role-playing table is, and I'm showing kind of a scenario of one here, is a case where you have two tables that relate, but they relate on different columns. So in this scenario I have on the screen, I have a sales table that relates to date, but there's multiple types of dates that I care about. I have a date table and a sales table. That date table stores a single row for every date, and then my sales table has a row for every transaction. In this case though, my sales table has multiple types of dates I care about. I have the date that something was ordered, the date that something was due to the customer, and then also the date that something was delivered, or the date that something was shipped to the customer. So I have these three dates that I care about, and I need all of them inside of a Power Pivot model. Well, the way Power Pivot works is it will only allow you to have one active relationship. And what active relationship means is whenever I drag something in from date, it's going to default to using this type of date. So in this case, it's going to default to using order date. whereas due date and ship date are inactive relationships. I'd actually have to write a little bit of code if I wanted to use those two types of relationship. Now, it's a little bit of a downside to Power Pivot, but again, there's ways to work through it and ways to make it work for you. So we'll talk about that as we get going here as well. We'll talk about that a little bit more in the DAX section. All right, so keep that in mind. That's kind of when you have role-playing tables, tables that relate on multiple ways. In that case, it was date to order date, due date, and ship date. Now, the other thing we care about talking about here is hierarchies. When you're creating a data model, you get to define user-defined hierarchies. And an example of one here is where I have a year, a quarter, a month, and a date naturally fit together, right? It's natural ways that you look at the data. And that's a great case, or a brilliant case, where you would actually create a hierarchy, where I would allow my users and really point my users to the natural way they would navigate the data. Now, hierarchies are beneficial in a couple ways. First of all, it helps me be able to get to the information very quickly. I can bring in one object that consolidates all of these columns together, the year, the quarter, the month, and the date, bring those all together into one single object. So my users can check one object, the calendar hierarchy, and it brings on all those fields. It's also useful if your users aren't very familiar with your data. So if they're brand new to looking at this data set and they don't really know how to navigate through it, things like this, hierarchies like this, can help them find their way through it. So that oftentimes is a great case for hierarchies to help people navigate through your data. Okay, so it's going to lead to having faster reporting because people can find the information they care about much quicker. And really, these are just ways of organizing your data, organizing the attributes in a way that makes sense, and it shows relationships between these different fields here. Okay, so that's why hierarchies are important, and I'm going to show you how to create a couple hierarchies here in a moment. Now, lastly, we're going to talk about usability enhancements, and the couple things we're going to mention here have to do with renaming columns and renaming tables and the benefit that you get from that. First of all, the reason you would do that is that I want to be able to present the data or present the model in a way that users are most comfortable with. So some people probably watching this right now have come from an environment where you have something like SAP. Now, SAP is a German database, and therefore the column names are all in German. So if I tried to hand that over to my typical end user, they would probably knife my tires. They would freak out. They would not know what to do with it. And what I can do inside the Power Pivot model is make a logical data model change so I can rename those columns to something that makes sense. So that's one of the great things that you can do. You can rename columns, you can rename tables, and spaces are okay. It's okay to put spaces in column and table names here. In fact, you should do it, because really you're preparing this model for the end users, so keep that in mind. The other thing that you can do is hide columns and hide tables from users. The reason you would do this is something like, for example, a key column. A key column is really important to the data model because it shows how things relate to each other, but it's not important to the users when it comes to reporting. When it comes to them actually creating a report, there's no need for them to be able to see a key column because they're not actually going to visualize that on a report. So keep that in mind. And another great reason for it is if you have so many fields that are part of your data model and they won't report on it, it can be a little overwhelming when it comes to actually visualizing that inside the field list. So you want to make sure that they're not overwhelmed with all these fields that they're not even going to use. Okay. Lastly, what we'll mention here is descriptions. You can add descriptions and kind of make your model self-documenting. It makes it so that whenever you browse, or maybe even an end user browses your cube through a tool like Power View, they can see little things like tooltips telling them what each of the objects do. So they get a nice little hover over whenever they hover over a table that tells them what the temperature table really is, that kind of thing. And we'll show a demonstration of that as well. Lastly, the sort order. We're going to talk about sort order because that's going to be really important when it comes to an example we're going to show with date. The scenario here with date is I have a list of all of my months, and I put all my months in here, January, February, March, but they're not showing up in the correct order. And the reason they're not showing up in the correct order is because January spelled out, February spelled out, March spelled out is going to be reorganized in a way so it's alphabetically organized correctly. Well, we don't want to sort it alphabetically, we want to sort it by the month number, for example. And so we're going to walk you through an example where you'll actually change the sort order so you sort the columns by the appropriate value rather than by the name of the column. So we'll take a look at that, or the name of the value really. So we'll take a look at that as well, and that's what we're going to do in this next demonstration. We'll sit down together, add a bunch of usability enhancements, create some relationships. You'll notice that we'll actually leave one relationship off because we need some DAX to be able to handle that one. And then we'll also create some hierarchies here. So let's sit down together and pull this together. Okay, in Module 4, what we're going to be doing is applying some more usability enhancements, as well as creating relationships and hierarchies between our objects. So let's start first by looking at what we have here. And I'm actually on a blank Excel workbook here, what it looks like a blank Excel workbook, but this is actually from our previous example, our Power Pivot model that we started working on. So the Excel front end itself doesn't have anything displayed, but if we go to the Power Pivot tab and click Manage, this will display the tables that we brought in our previous module inside Module 3. Now, if you missed Module 3 or you're trying to catch up, you can look underneath the instructor notes and grab the Module 3 example, which will have what we completed in the previous module. Again, this is Module 4, where we're going to now be making enhancements to what we did in that previous module. So what we're going to do to start off with is we're going to create relationships between objects that do not have relationships. We create relationships not underneath the data view, which is what we're looking at right now, but instead underneath the diagram view, which we can go to either by selecting diagram view in the top or by selecting diagram in the bottom right. Either place will take us to the same location, where we'll see a basic database diagram of all the objects that we pulled in. Now, what I usually recommend doing here is pulling in your fact table, or really your table that has all the foreign key relationships, into the middle, so that way you can easily navigate and relate everything to that particular table. Now, we actually have several other tables that are also going to need to be related here. So I'm going to surround my internet sales table by these other ones that we've already talked about previously when we did the import. Okay, so basically just kind of making a little surrounding so it's a little easier to view. All this is just as usability to be able to find and see everything. Now you'll notice here this is our internet table, our internet sales table, and inside that internet sales table we have several key values. We have a product key, an order date key, due date key, ship date key, and customer key, and there's several more that continue on and on and on in here. Again, this is our central table that has all of our metrics in it, and therefore also has relationships to each of our dimension tables. Now, while it has a relationship, this Power Pivot model has not created relationships inside of it. So sometimes when you pull in data, you'll automatically get relationships that are created for you without you having to do anything. So you'll actually see lines that are represented between your different tables here to indicate that there is a relationship. In this case, I've actually intentionally made it so we don't have relationships so that we can go through the practice of creating relationships between these tables. Now let's start inside the internet sales table. The best way to start is look at your internet sales table or your fact table that has all the metrics in it and look at the columns that you have. So you'll notice right here I have a product key column that probably relates to my product key column I have inside the product table. Okay, just to educate you a little bit about the database here, product key inside internet sales is the foreign key, and product key inside the product table is the primary key. What that means is that I have one unique product key listed over and over and over inside my product table. But I can have many instances of a product inside the sales table. Makes sense, right? I want a list of my products inside the product table, and I want every instance that product was sold inside my internet sales table. Okay, so it's a foreign key inside internet sales, it's a primary key inside the product table. Okay, now what we want to do to actually relate these two objects is fairly simple. We're going to drag from our foreign key, remember that's what I just said is inside internet sales, and we're going to drag from the foreign key to the primary key, just like this. It's just a click and a drag. It's a drag and drop. So I clicked and held down on product key and dragged that up into product key inside my product table, and I now have a relationship between these two tables, and you can see that is indicated by the line between them. The line going into the primary key. Now you can double click on this line here to actually see what is represented by that relationship. All I did here, let me show you once more. All I did was I double clicked, or you can right click and say edit relationship. And this takes you to the window to see what the relationship is made up of. Again, this tells us here that the table internet sales has a column called product key, and it has a lookup table, or in this case a dimension table, called product, with a related lookup column called product key. Again, the bottom is the primary key, the top is the foreign key. Now we're going to talk about this active and inactive relationships in a little bit, but just note that this has an active relationship, and this has to do with role-playing dimensions, which we'll talk about here in just a moment. Alright, so hit OK here. and that'll again redefine that relationship. You'll notice in the bottom there it said updating relationship. Anytime you make a change, it's going to write that back to our model. All right, so we did our first relationship between product key inside internet sales and product key inside the product table. We're now going to move down and find, by the way, you can expand this and make it larger if you want, and we'll also talk about this expand button here in a few moments. But we're now going to move down to the date columns. You'll notice we have 3 date columns listed here. We have an order date, a due date key, and a ship date key. And in reality, they all relate to this date table that we have over here. Okay, so order date, due date, and ship date are all foreign keys to the primary key of date key inside the date table. This is what's known as a role-playing dimension because the date table actually plays the role of 3 separate dates. This is an order date, this is a due date, and a ship date. Now we're going to talk about how to handle this more whenever we get to our section on DAX, the query language for Power Pivot. But until then, I'm not going to get too deep into it because we're just going to take baby steps here. So let's, for the time being, let's just simply create a relationship between the order date key and the date key. Okay. We will come back and talk about the other ones because typically you'll actually have multiple relationships like this where you have a date relationship between due date as well. Now don't follow this right now. I just want to show you that there is a concept here of role-playing dimensions where you have active and inactive relationships. The active relationship being order date right now, and the inactive relationship, that dotted line, is represented by the due date. Okay? I'm going to delete this for now because we will come back and talk about that in much more in depth when we get to DAX. Okay? So simply all we need right now is a relationship between order date key and date key. Okay? Moving along, let's go a little bit further down inside of our internet sales table. We want to also relate customer key inside internet sales to customer key in the customer table. Okay, so simply drag and drop again, just like we've done a couple times now. And then we'll continue to go down a little bit further until we get to sales territory key. Sales territory key, we also want to create a relationship by simply dragging and dropping to our sales territory key in the sales territory table. You'll notice we have one left, and we're intentionally not going to create a relationship here yet because we're also going to talk about how to deal with this table when we get to DAX. What's unique about this table is it doesn't really have a direct key, not yet anyways, to the internet sales. And in the DAX section, we'll actually talk about how to get around that. So far, all we need to have is 4 relationships between internet sales and the original tables that we pulled in. The temp table will be fixed later. All right, so let's do this. We've gotten the relationships created here. Our next step is to implement some usability features. Some usability features like creating hierarchies. We have 2 tables that are really kind of asking for hierarchies here. One of those tables is the date table. Now I pointed out to you earlier there's a maximize button here right on top of the table that we're looking at. And if we click that maximize button, it'll launch open a larger view of that table. Makes it a little easier to see because they're all kind of tiny in this diagram view. Again, that was just the maximize button in the top right of the table itself. So click maximize and it'll give you a full view of the table. Now to create a hierarchy, there's a button in the very top right called create hierarchies. And the purpose of creating this hierarchy is so that it makes and gives us some more usability enhancements. So whenever our users want to look at dates, they don't have to drag in year, quarter, month, and date. They can simply drag in a calendar hierarchy that we create, or a calendar drill down, and that gives them everything that they're going to want. So it saves them quite a bit of time there. Okay? So that's the purpose of the hierarchy. All right, so let's go ahead and hit create hierarchy in that top right button. Okay? And we'll name this hierarchy calendar drill down. Okay? Now, to actually add different columns to this hierarchy, we'll go find the columns that we want. So we want columns like the calendar year, which you'll click and drag down. And you want to drag it right on top of that drill down or that hierarchy. And I also want to see calendar quarter right here. Okay, by the way, in case you make an accident and don't drag them in the appropriate order, you can fix it later. I'll show you that in a moment. But generally, you want to go top down, meaning the highest granularity at the top, so year at the top, to the lowest granularity at the bottom. Alright, so we have year, quarter, and the next one will be month, which will drag from the English month name right here. And we'll drop that right below quarter. Now again, I told you in case you make a mistake, you can fix it. So if I had dragged in month between year and quarter, like so, you can always come back and fix it just by simply clicking and dragging it to the appropriate spot. So if you make a mistake, you can fix it. Okay. Alright, then the last one that we're going to do is we'll drag and find the date. And we're going to use the full date alternate key for this example. So go all the way to the top and drag full date alternate key to the bottom inside your hierarchy. It's going to be the lowest granularity of our hierarchy. Okay? You can either drop it right on top of the drill down, or you can drag it down to the bottom. Either way, it'll get placed on the bottom. Okay? So that's creating a hierarchy. Let's go through this exercise one more time, but this time on a different table. So I'm going to minimize or restore that table where we just created our date or our calendar hierarchy, and we're going to go over to the sales territory table where we'll create another hierarchy. You can create hierarchies without maximizing it. I'm going to go ahead and maximize it though, just so it's easier to view, and I'll hit create hierarchy. Okay, now I'll call this our territory drill down. Give it an appropriate name. Some people like the word hierarchy, some people like the word drill down, whatever your preference is, or really whatever your end user's preference is. And inside this one, I'm going to drag in the columns for our sales territory group. I'm also going to drag in the sales territory country, and then finally region. Okay. Again, if you make a mistake, you can always fix it after the fact. Okay. So we now have two hierarchies, and those two hierarchies will allow our users to quickly find the data they care about. So they can navigate through the data and get a more purposeful report or a more useful report. Okay? Now some other usability enhancements that we talked about in this module were things like renaming. So you're looking at a table right now where we have a bunch of column names that are a little bit long, right? They have the same name over and over and over in it. And we also want to talk about hiding values that we don't care about. So let's talk about hiding first, because if we can hide some of these values, we don't necessarily have to rename them. So what I mean by hiding is you need these columns. So for example, I need columns that like these key columns. I need product key, I need order date key, so I can create relationships. But my users don't necessarily have to know about those values. They can't do anything with them. They're not useful to them because they're just database keys. And they're in fact they're just integer values that don't really represent anything in the data. So because of that, it would be very helpful if I could hide some of these, so whenever my users are trying to create reports, they don't necessarily see these useless columns as far as reporting purposes. I do, however, need these for creating relationships. So to hide columns, you simply select the columns you want to hide, and you can multi-select. So you can multi-select columns that you don't care to keep. Okay, so I can hold down Shift, or hold down Control rather, and select the columns I don't care about as far as for reporting purposes. So this may be all of the columns that I have that are key columns. So I can right click on any of these key column values that we see, and then simply right click and tell it that I want to hide in the client view. Now you can do multi-select, or you can do them one by one. I prefer to kind of do multi-select to knock out several of them all at once. So I'll select that I want to hide these in the client tool, and then that way whenever I go to report on these, or my users go to report on them, they won't see these columns and they won't be distracted by these columns that aren't really helpful for reporting purposes. Okay, you'll see that what it looks like whenever you do have one hidden, it's kind of grayed out. It's a little bit gray, so you know that it's not going to be visible in the client tool. Okay, I'd also recommend coming through and renaming these columns. Now you can go and hide quite a few more columns if you want. For the purposes of our demonstration, I'm not going to hide all of the ones I really want. The completed instructor demo will have many more hidden than I'm going to be able to hide here in our short amount of time. But really all you have to do is go through, select the columns you want, and right click and click on hide in client tools, just like we already showed once. Okay, so you can go through and hide quite a few more if you'd like. Alright, and so the next portion here that we're going to talk about is renaming some of these columns. So renaming them so they're a little bit better for usability. So for example, if we go back to sales territory where we were a few moments ago and maximize this so we can see it better, I probably want to rename some of these columns and maybe hide a few of these other ones as well, like sales territory alternate key isn't very meaningful to me, so I may want to hide this one as well. Okay. By the way, I will mention this, you can create multiple hierarchies, so if I wanted another hierarchy to be part of this, I could add another one in. But what we want to do is we want to rename some of these columns. So I have sales territory region, sales territory country, sales territory group, sales territory image, and it's just a little redundant, right? So what I'd like to do is I want to right click on these and select rename. And I'll rename each of these to something that's more appropriate. Something like perhaps just region. Okay? And instead of sales territory country, maybe I'll just rename this one to just be called country. Okay? Saves and removes and really saves you quite a bit of time and makes more sense to your users. Because a lot of these column headers or column names have names just for design inside of a database. Database design may have made sense to have sales territory as a prefix in all of these, but as far as reporting purposes, I could care less whether I have the prefix sales territory on here or not. Same within your hierarchy. So I can rename the columns inside my hierarchy, or I can keep them the same, whatever I prefer. You'll notice the little name inside parentheses. That name inside the parentheses is the column that it's coming from. So this one is coming from the country column here. Remember we dragged that over earlier. I've just renamed it at this point. But I can rename each of these as well, so they're called group, country, and region. Something more appropriate for this table. Again, all I'm doing is I'm right-clicking, selecting rename on each of the columns, and giving it a new name. Now you can have spaces in the names as well. So if you find some columns or some tables that have columns with concatenated values, or really names that have camel casing. For example, let's look at the date table here. Inside my date table, I can see that there's several column names in here where it probably would make sense that they have spaces in it. There's also probably several in here that I would like to rename. So for example, full date alternate key is really just date. So I could right click on this, tell it to rename it, and just call it date, which is a little bit more appropriate. I could do that on any of these other columns here as well. I can come in here and maybe rename this one to just English space name. I'd probably want to hide some of these columns in here, like the Spanish ones. If I don't care about Spanish name columns, I can remove those or hide them. I could also hide things like fiscal dates if I don't care about that for our quick example here. So it's simple. We just right click, tell what we want to hide, and then go through and rename the columns that we want to rename. So come through here, rename this one to be year. This is the column inside of our hierarchy here. Rename that first one to be year. I'll rename the second one to be quarter. Rename this next one to be month. Okay, and then this last one should be date. And like I mentioned, if it makes sense to have spaces inside the name of a column, you're more than welcome to do that as well. So for example, I have in here week number of year. If I'd like to keep this column but just add spaces into it, I can do that. I can come through here, rename it, and add in spaces where it makes sense. Okay. Now again, I don't have time to do that for every single one of the columns that we have in here. There's quite a few columns where it would make sense that I add spaces and rename them. I recommend that you pull in, before you go to the next example, before you go to the next module, pull in the completed instructor demo for module 4, where I went ahead and I renamed each of these and I've created all the hierarchies for us and created the relationships as well. So this module, what we covered was creating relationships. Remember, we created relationships between each of our tables. You see each of those relationships here. We also covered creating hierarchies. We created a hierarchy inside the date table as well as inside sales territory. And then we talked about some usability features like hiding columns that aren't necessary. We also talked about dealing with renaming of columns. Again, this is supposed to be renamed so it's appropriate for your users. Now the last thing I'll show you before we move on is what this would look like now if we tried to create a report. Now don't get too much in the bogged down in the details of actually using pivot tables because we have a module devoted to that. But I do want to show you that we actually have some functional data now. And I can do that by going over to where it says pivot table on the very top, telling it that I want to create a pivot table. Just hit the button. And then I can either create a new worksheet or create an existing worksheet or add my pivot table to an existing worksheet. Also select existing worksheet and hit OK. Now you'll notice here on the far right, we're going to cover this in much more in detail later, but I just want to demonstrate something to you very quickly, so don't be too worried if I don't get into the details of how I'm doing this at this point. But what I want to show you is a problem that we have. The problem that we have is if we look at the sales for each of our years, this looks fine, but as we start to drill down deeper and deeper, we see each of our quarters. This is the hierarchy that we created. This is what the hierarchy looks like. And as we drill down one level further, you'll notice a problem. The problem here is that our months are actually sorted alphabetically rather than chronologically. So within inside of each quarter, it's got the appropriate months in them, but it's not sorting them within the months appropriately. So we have one little fix here I'm going to show you before we end this module is how to fix our sort order. Keep in mind this hierarchy did have 4 levels. We had year, quarter, month, and day. If I go down even further, I do see the day here as well. That one is sorted appropriately. Alright, so the last problem we're going to fix here in this module is the sort order of our months. Now, if we go back to our Power Pivot window, which you can do by going back over here to where it says Power Pivot for Excel, you could also go back to the Power Pivot tab and hit Manage, and this will launch that Power Pivot window again. The problem that we're having has to do with the sorting of our month. Now, if we look at our hierarchy, look at what we used inside of our hierarchy. Inside of our hierarchy, for the month column, we used a field called English Month Name. So we're actually using the name of the month to populate our drill down or our hierarchy. So that tells you why we have the problem. It's actually sorting it alphabetically by January, February, March in the alphabetical order rather than the chronological order, which is actually what I named off there. Now to fix this problem, we probably could look at what we have inside of this date table. Inside of this date table, you'll see that we have in here the English month name, which is the column we're currently using, but we also have the month number of year right here. That month number of year will allow us to sort this appropriately because the month number of year is a number value that represents each month. So January is 1, February is 2, March is 3, so on and so forth. So what we'd like to do here is rather than sorting alphabetically, we want to sort chronologically. Now to fix this problem, we need to go back over to the data view. That's that tab up at the very top inside of our home ribbon. We'll change our view from the diagram view, which was what we're looking at right now, to the data view. So select data view and then go over to our date table because we're trying to fix a problem inside of our date table. Now the problem exists on our English month name column. You see that column listed right here. Okay. Now what we'd like to do is fix this English month name column so it doesn't sort on itself. Again, in itself would be sorting alphabetically because it's a string. We would rather sort it by a number, and we have that month number a little bit further over called month number of year. So basically what we want to do to this column is display the month name but sort by the month number. Now this can be done by selecting the column you want to sort, which is the English month name, and then go up to the ribbon and find the sort by column underneath the home tab. Okay, so we'll select sort by column. Tell it the column we want to sort on the left-hand side, which is already selected, English month name, and we want to sort it by the column called month number of year. So scroll down till you find month number of year inside the date table, and then you can see here that our property is set. Okay, so this property says display month name, but sort by month number. As soon as we hit OK, the next time we go back to our pivot table, so we can go back to our main Excel window, you'll notice our data has now been sorted. Now if you're using Excel 2010, you may have to hit a little refresh button inside the pivot table field list, but 2013 automatically does the refresh, and that's why mine's already showing the refresh data here. Okay, so that completes this module. Again, this module covered how to create relationships, creating hierarchies, and other usability enhancements like the sorting we just showed, also renaming and hiding fields.